The surgical suite aboard the UCN Mercy was the pinnacle of human medical engineering and operating theater of glass, sterile metal, and precision robotics. Rows of holo displays cast shifting blue light across the room, their data streams pulsing with real-time telemetry. The air smelled of antiseptics and recycled oxygen, cool and metallic, a stark contrast to the heated argument brewing over the patient lying on the table. Dr. Erik Lannett pulled on his gloves, flexing his fingers to test the fit. Across from him, Chief Surgeon Velrax of the Xelnari stood motionless, his tendrils curling and uncurling in nervous anticipation. His species lacked facial expressions, but Erik had worked with enough Xelnari to recognize the signs of deep unease. The patient between them, a hybrid organism, part human, part Xelnari, was failing. Its translucent skin was stretched taut over a body that defied biological logic, a fusion of two species never meant to coexist. Human arteries intertwined with Xelnari vascular sacs, nerve clusters meshed with biosynthetic regulators, and somewhere within that fragile balance, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The hybrid was dying, and no one knew why. Velrax's 3 luminous eyes darted across the monitors, his translator implant humming as he spoke. The circulatory matrix is destabilizing. Oxygen saturation is dropping. A systemic failure is imminent. Erik clenched his jaw. Then let's fix it. Velrax's tendrils twitched, his scalpel-like surgical tool hovering uncertainly over the hybrid's exposed thoracic cavity. We lack sufficient data to proceed. Without an anatomical projection, any incision could trigger. Erik grabbed a scalpel. Velrax flinched. Lannett, what are you? We don't have time. Erik's voice was steady, but his pulse pounded in his ears. His hand hovered over the hybrid's chest, just above a mass of intertwined arteries and fluid sacs. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the Xelnari and human observers standing beyond the surgical field, watching with apprehension. Velrax's tendrils stiffened. If you cut blindly, you could cause an irreversible cascade failure. If we wait, the patient dies anyway, Erik shot back. Velrax hesitated. You humans are reckless. Erik exhaled sharply, and you Xelnari are too careful. The hybrid convulsed suddenly, its body arching against the restraints. The monitors screamed in alarm, oxygen levels plummeting, neural activity spiking into erratic bursts. The hybrid's eyes, an unnatural blend of human irises and Xelnari bioluminescence, flickered open in blind panic. Velrax recoiled. It's regaining consciousness. Sedation isn't holding, one of the nurses yelled. Erik slammed a hand against the table to steady the thrashing body. Give me 5 cc's of neurostabilizer now. A mechanical arm descended, injecting the dose into the hybrid's central vascular node. The patient shuddered violently, then slumped back, muscles twitching in aftershocks. Velrax exhaled, his tendrils slowly uncurling. The fusion strain is destabilizing faster than anticipated. The regulatory implants should be compensating, but they are failing. This experiment was premature. This experiment is still a person, Erik snapped, and we're going to keep them alive. Velrax hesitated, then inclined his head slightly, a Xelnari gesture of reluctant concession. He turned to the holo display, summoning a 3-dimensional representation of the hybrid's internal structure. The image flickered as the ship's AI struggled to interpret the shifting bioarchitecture. We must identify the source of the failure before proceeding, Velrax said. A direct intervention could trigger a multi-system collapse. Erik ran a hand down his face. We don't have time for theoreticals, Velrax. The patient's vitals are crashing now. Theoreticals prevent unnecessary deaths, Velrax countered. Surgical improvisation without predictive modeling is a gamble. Erik opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the hybrid's body spasmed violently. Its chest convulsed, its limbs jerked, and a deep, wet gurgling sound escaped its throat. The monitors blared a new alarm. Cardiac event, a nurse shouted. Velrax's tendrils flared. It's going into arrest. Erik acted on instinct. Prep the defib paddles. A robotic arm extended from the ceiling, presenting a pair of compact defibrillator units. Erik grabbed them, positioning them over the hybrid's chest. He glanced at Velrax. Their nervous system might not react like ours. Any reason this won't work? Velrax's translator crackled with uncertainty. The energy distribution could cause neural feedback. It may not restart the heart, it could trigger synaptic overload. And if we don't try, Erik pressed. Velrax hesitated. Erik cursed under his breath and made the call, charging to 50 joules. The paddles hummed as they powered up. The hybrid's body convulsed violently under the shock, its back arching, mouth gaping in silent agony. The monitors fluctuated, momentarily stabilizing, then plummeting again. Again, Erik shouted. Wait, Velrax started, but Erik had already activated the second charge. The hybrid jerked once, then went limp. A long, unbroken alarm tone filled the room. Flatline. Velrax's tendrils curled in silent horror. You have killed them. Erik's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled slightly, still clutching the paddles. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, we can still. A mechanical voice interrupted. Warning, unidentified neural activity detected. Erik's eyes snapped to the monitors. The flat line remained unchanged, but beneath it, another waveform began to flicker. Erratic, unstable. Neural activity, Velrax murmured. But the cardiac function is gone. The hybrid's body twitched. A faint shudder, barely noticeable. Velrax took a step back. Lannett, what have you done? Erik stared at the hybrid's unmoving form, his pulse hammering. He didn't have an answer. The patient was clinically dead, but something was still happening inside that body. Something neither of them understood. The surgical suite remained deathly silent. The hybrid lay motionless on the table, its chest unnaturally still, its bioluminescent veins dimming beneath translucent skin. The sharp, unbroken alarm tone of the flatline blared through the room, a stark declaration of failure. Yet, the neural activity remained. Erik's grip tightened around the defibrillator paddles, his knuckles white. He should have been calling time of death, stepping back, acknowledging the inevitable. But his instincts screamed at him that something wasn't right. Velrax stood rigid, his three eyes fixed on the fluctuating neural readout. His tendrils coiled inward, a Xelnari display of deep unease. The heart has ceased function, yet the synaptic patterns persist. This is not possible. Erik slammed the paddles down on the table. It's happening. Velrax, so let's figure out why instead of standing here gawking at it. Velrax's tendrils twitched, but he turned back to the holo display. The ship's AI struggled to map the hybrid's internal systems, the readout flickering as it attempted to process conflicting biological data. The neural signals are erratic, Velrax muttered, adjusting the projection. They are not centralized. They are dispersing. Erik's stomach tightened. What do you mean, dispersing? Velrax expanded the neural scan. Human cognitive function is centralized within a single organ, the brain. Xelnari consciousness, however, is decentralized. We do not have a singular brain, but rather an interwoven network of neuroclusters distributed throughout our bodies. His luminous eyes darkened in thought. The hybrid structure was designed to support both forms of cognition. But if the cardiac failure disrupted the balance? The realization hit Erik like a physical blow. Then the hybrid isn't dead. It's reorganizing, Velrax finished grimly, attempting to reroute cognitive function to maintain coherence. But it cannot sustain this. If we do not intervene soon, the dispersal will reach a critical threshold, and the individual's consciousness will fragment beyond recovery. The words settled heavily in the room. Erik exhaled through his nose. Then we're still in this, he turned sharply to the medical staff. We need to stabilize the patient's systems while we figure out how to restart circulatory function. Options. A human nurse hesitated before stepping forward. We could introduce a controlled perfusion oxygenated nanofluid to maintain tissue viability while we work to restart organ function. Velrax made a sharp clicking noise, something between skepticism and consideration. That would prevent immediate necrosis, but it would not resolve the systemic failure. It buys us time, Erik countered. Get it prepped. The nurse nodded. moving swiftly to retrieve the necessary equipment. Velrax hesitated. Lannett, this approach does not guarantee success. Neither does standing here and hoping the problem solves itself. Erik shot back. We need to do something. Velrax studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he inclined his head slightly in concession. The perfusion system was deployed within minutes. A thin, translucent tube was inserted into the hybrid's vascular access points, and the oxygenated nanofluid was carefully pumped through its failing circulatory network. The monitors registered a faint stabilization in tissue integrity, but the core problem remained. The hybrid was still dying. Velrax exhaled sharply. We must determine why the cardiovascular system failed. If the synthetic regulators were functioning as intended, this should not have occurred. Erik frowned. The regulatory implants. He moved to the holo display, bringing up a schematic of the hybrid's internal architecture. The implants were designed to bridge the gap between human and Xelnari biology, maintaining equilibrium between their incompatible systems. They were meant to be infallible. Except they weren't. There, Velrax said suddenly, pointing with a tendril. That implant Sector 7. It is inactive. Erik's gut twisted. He magnified the image. That's the primary circulatory stabilizer. His voice hardened. If it shut down, that would explain the cardiac event. Velrax's eyes darkened. Implant failure should not be possible. Clearly, it is. Erik turned to a nearby technician. Get me a direct diagnostic on that implant. I want to know why it failed. The technician nodded, fingers flying across the console. Seconds later, a result appeared on the display. Erik's blood ran cold. Manual override, the technician read aloud. He looked up, confused. The implant wasn't defective. It was deactivated remotely. Velrax's tendrils stiffened. Someone did this intentionally. Erik's jaw clenched. Looks that way. A silence fell over the room, thick with tension. The implications were immediate and damning. The hybrid's collapse hadn't been a biological failure. It had been sabotage. Who has access to these implants? Erik demanded. The technician hesitated. Only high-level personnel, lead researchers, senior medical staff, diplomatic oversight. Velrax turned to Erik. This vessel was chosen as neutral ground for this experiment. If sabotage has occurred, then someone aboard this ship has compromised that neutrality. Erik cursed under his breath. He turned back to the patient, watching as the nanofluid pumped through its fragile body. It was a temporary fix, nothing more. The hybrid wouldn't last without its natural circulatory function. We don't have time for an investigation right now, Erik said. We need to get that implant back online and stabilize the patient before we lose them permanently. Velrax nodded. I will attempt to reactivate it remotely. He moved to the console, working swiftly. Erik watched the monitors, willing the numbers to change, the vitals to stabilize. His fingers twitched at his sides. The urge to act, to cut, to intervene, to do something tangible was nearly unbearable. Minutes dragged by. Then, I have restored the implant's function, Velrax announced. Erik's eyes snapped to the monitors. The circulatory readings flickered, adjusting. A faint pulse registered. Weak, erratic, but there. Velrax exhaled in something like relief. The cardiovascular system is reinitializing, but it is unstable. Erik nodded grimly. Then it's time to do what we came here to do. He turned to the medical team. Prep for surgery. Velrax hesitated. You intend to operate immediately. You said it yourself, Erik said. The hybrid system is in flux. If we don't intervene now, it'll collapse again, and we might not be able to bring them back a second time. Velrax studied him. You are prepared to perform surgery on a patient whose biology we barely comprehend, with no guarantee of success. Erik met his gaze without flinching. You hesitated last time. I didn't, and we're both standing here with a second chance because of it. Velrax's tendrils curled, but after a moment he nodded. Then let us begin. Erik turned back to the table. The hybrid's fate was still uncertain. But now, finally, they had a fighting chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. The surgical suite hummed with controlled urgency. The hybrid lay on the table, its translucent skin reflecting the sterile overhead lights. Its vitals flickered in and out of stability, the newly reactivated implant struggling to maintain homeostasis. Erik stood at the head of the table, surgical instruments laid out in a precise row beside him. Velrax loomed opposite him, his tendrils twitching as he calibrated the holo display. "We will need to work quickly," Velrax said, scanning the hybrid's unstable readings. "The circulatory system is active, but the fluctuations suggest ongoing systemic instability. We must identify and resolve the core issue before another failure occurs." Erik nodded. "No time to wait for projections. We go in." Velrax's eyes darkened slightly, but he did not argue. The prep work was done in minutes. The hybrid had been placed under a controlled neural suppressant sedation had already failed once, and they weren't taking any chances this time. The nanofluid continued circulating to keep tissue oxygenated, but it was a temporary solution at best. Erik pulled the scalpel from its sterile casing. The instrument felt natural in his grip, an extension of himself. He positioned it over the hybrid's chest and made the first incision. Velrax tensed but said nothing. The hybrid's internal structure was just as chaotic as before. Layers of synthetic and organic tissue intertwined in ways that defied conventional medicine. The human arteries had fused into the Xelnari vascular sacs in irregular patterns, forming clusters of biofluid nodes that pulsed at erratic intervals, and at the center of it all, embedded deep within the hybrid's core, was the implant that had failed its casing darkened as if burned from within. "There's our problem," Erik muttered. The implant suffered internal damage. Restarting it was only a patch. Velrax studied the exposed structure, his tendrils hovering inches above the implant. A direct power failure would not have caused this level of biological disruption. This suggests. He hesitated. Erik shot him a glance. "Suggests what?" Velrax's eyes narrowed. That the failure was not merely an external shutdown. The implant was programmed to disrupt itself. It was never meant to restart. Erik's stomach twisted. Whoever sabotaged this didn't just want to disable it. They wanted the hybrid to die, no recovery possible. Velrax nodded. "And if we do not resolve the damage, the collapse will begin again." Erik gritted his teeth. "Then we'd better get to work." They fell into a rhythm. Erik worked with practiced efficiency, removing damaged tissue around the implant, clearing necrotic material before it could spread. Velrax followed, his tendrils delicately sealing Xelnari fluid sacs as Erik cut through human tissue. It was a delicate balancing act. Every action had consequences. Every adjustment had to account for both species' biology. For the first time since the operation began, Velrax wasn't hesitating. He was matching Erik's pace, adapting as they went, trusting instinct over calculated models. "Clamp here," Erik said, pointing. Velrax reacted instantly, using a microsuture tool to seal off a leaking fluid sac before it could rupture. "Adjust pressure," Velrax instructed. Erik nodded, shifting the retractor slightly to relieve strain on a delicate nerve cluster. Despite everything, the unknown anatomy, the impossibility of the situation, the surgery was working. But then, an alarm blared. "Pressure drop," a nurse shouted. Erik looked up at the monitors. The hybrid's oxygen saturation was plummeting. The implant was failing again, but this time something else was happening. The biofluid nodes surrounding it began pulsing erratically, their color darkening. Velrax, Erik asked, already reaching for an emergency stabilizer. Velrax's tendrils flared in alarm. "The system is rejecting the repair. The hybrid's body is treating the implant as a foreign entity." Erik cursed. A rejection response. Now. Velrax's translator crackled. The reactivation must have triggered a latent failsafe. The hybrid's immune network is attacking its own systems. Erik's mind raced. A standard immune rejection would mean tissue inflammation, cellular degradation, bad, but manageable. But this wasn't a standard rejection. The hybrid's immune system wasn't just responding, it was evolving. The biofluid nodes swelled rapidly, forming fibrous tendrils that latched onto the implant. Within seconds, the once dormant device was being actively consumed. "That implant won't last another 5 minutes," Erik muttered. "Then we must remove it," Velrax said. Erik hesitated. The implant was the only thing keeping the hybrid system in tenuous balance. Removing it without an immediate replacement could trigger a complete shutdown. "Do we have a backup implant?" Erik asked sharply. A nurse shook her head. "That was the only one designed specifically for this physiology. We have standard human and Xelnari models, but they won't work," Velrax finished. Erik exhaled sharply. "Then we need another option." Velrax studied the failing implant, his tendrils flicking in rapid succession. Perhaps a direct bypass. Erik's brows furrowed. "You mean replacing the implant's function with organic grafts?" Velrax nodded. "If we can create an artificial circulatory stabilization using both human and Xelnari biological material, we may be able to sustain equilibrium without an implant." Erik stared at him. "That's never been done before." Velrax's eyes flicked to the hybrid's vitals, still dropping. "Neither has this patient." Erik set his jaw. "What do we need?" Velrax moved swiftly. "We will need viable vascular grafts from both human and Xelnari donor segments of arterial and biofluid tissue that can be fused to create a new stabilization network." Erik turned to the medical staff. "We have compatible donors aboard." The nurse nodded. "We do, but the process." "There's no time," Erik cut in. "Prep the donors, extract the necessary grafts, and get them sterilized. Now." The medical team scrambled into motion. Velrax's tendrils curled tightly. "This procedure is untested." "Everything about this situation is untested," Erik countered. "But we don't have a choice." Minutes later, the grafts arrived. The tissue samples, one human artery, one Xelnari fluid conduit, were suspended in sterile solution, still viable. Erik studied them. "We fuse these together, run them in place of the implant, and hope the hybrid system accepts it." Velrax exhaled. "It is the best option we have." Erik nodded, rolling his shoulders. "All right, let's make history." The operation began. Erik worked quickly, carefully stitching the two biological grafts together. Velrax followed, reinforcing the connections with micro-sutures, ensuring the fusion was seamless. The process was delicate. If either graft failed, the patient would crash immediately. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the last connection was made. "Activate circulation," Erik ordered. Velrax initiated the bypass. The hybrid's vitals wavered, then stabilized. The monitors leveled out. The erratic pulses slowed. The biofluid nodes receded. Erik held his breath. Then, a heartbeat. A real one. Not the artificial rhythm of an implant. Not the erratic flickering of a failing system. A steady, organic pulse. Velrax's tendrils unfurled slightly. "It is working." Erik exhaled. Yeah, he let out a short, breathless laugh. "Yeah, it is." The hybrid was alive. And for the first time since the operation began, Erik allowed himself to believe they had won. The surgical suite had been a battlefield, but now it was quiet. Not silent, never silent. The steady rhythm of the hybrid's heartbeat filled the room, the soft hum of monitors and the faint beeping of stabilizing vitals forming a backdrop to the exhausted medical team. Erik exhaled slowly, peeling off his gloves. His arms ached, his muscles tight from hours of precision work, but the tension in his chest was gone. The hybrid was alive. And not just alive, it was stabilizing under its own power. Velrax stood across the table, his tendrils shifting in an unfamiliar, almost hesitant way. His 3 luminous eyes remained locked on the patient, as if expecting something to go wrong, as if struggling to believe what had just happened. "We succeeded," Velrax finally said, his voice carrying something dangerously close to wonder. Erik let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, we did." He glanced at the monitors. The hybrid's biosigns were steady. The improvised vascular bypass was holding, compensating for the lost implant. The body had accepted the graft, adjusting in real time, the human and Xelnari tissues working together in a way that no scientist had ever predicted. It wasn't just survival. It was evolution. Velrax tilted his head, scanning the data. This was not supposed to be possible. Well, you're looking at it, Erik muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. So either our understanding was wrong, or this hybrid just rewrote medical science while unconscious. Velrax's eyes darkened in thought. Perhaps both. The quiet moment didn't last long. The doors hissed open, and a wave of voices crashed into the room. Human officers, Xelnari delegates, medical administrators, everyone who had been waiting outside stormed in at once, their expressions ranging from awe to barely concealed outrage. A Xelnari official, his silver-hued exosuit gleaming under the bright surgical lights, pushed forward first. Explain what has happened here. Erik turned to face him, his exhaustion rapidly giving way to irritation. We saved a life. That's what happened. The official's three eyes narrowed. You performed an unauthorized procedure, utilizing untested biological integration. You disregarded protocol, ignored diplomatic oversight, and acted recklessly. Erik folded his arms. You're welcome. Velrax stepped forward before the situation could escalate. The patient's implant was sabotaged. A direct attempt was made to ensure their death. Without intervention, they would not have survived. The Xelnari official stiffened. Murmurs broke out among the gathered crowd. A human officer, a high-ranking medical director, stepped beside Erik. You're sure it was sabotage? Velrax gestured toward the holo display. The implant was remotely deactivated, and an internal failsafe triggered a system-wide collapse. This was deliberate. The room went even quieter. The implications hung heavy in the air. Erik folded his arms. Someone wanted this hybrid dead, and I want to know why. The Xelnari official hesitated before responding. This experiment was meant to be a demonstration of cooperation between our species, a proof of concept that such integration was possible. If someone wished for its failure, then they opposed that union. Erik's jaw tightened. You're telling me this was political? Velrax's tendrils curled. It is a logical conclusion. Erik let out a sharp breath. He had expected complications, biological challenges, ethical concerns. But not this. Not sabotage rooted in fear, in power struggles beyond the operating table. The Xelnari official regarded them both carefully. There will be an investigation. Until we determine who is responsible, access to this patient will be restricted. Erik took a step forward. Like hell it will. Velrax placed a tendril on Erik's arm, a Xelnari gesture of restraint. Lannett. Erik gritted his teeth but forced himself to take a breath. The Xelnari official observed him for a long moment. You are not what we expected of human physicians. Yeah, Erik muttered. I get that a lot. The official turned sharply and exited, leaving the humans and Xelnari to exchange wary glances. Erik looked back at the hybrid. Their chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Their face was calm, their strange bioluminescent veins glowing faintly beneath their skin. They were no longer just an experiment. They were proof of what was possible. Velrax was still staring at the patient, his expression unreadable. You're thinking something, Erik said. Velrax's tendrils twitched. I am reconsidering. Assumptions. Yeah, Erik smirked. Which ones? Velrax exhaled slowly. When we first met, I believed human medicine was reckless, chaotic, inefficient. You weren't wrong, Erik said. We just happen to be really good at making reckless, chaotic things work. Velrax regarded him with an almost imperceptible nod. I have come to see that. A long pause. Then, Velrax extended one of his tendrils toward Erik, a Xelnari gesture of respect. Erik hesitated for only a second before gripping it firmly, shaking once before letting go. Velrax's tendrils curled slightly, the Xelnari equivalent of a smile. Next time, I will not hesitate. Erik huffed out a tired laugh. Good. Next time, we might not be so lucky. They stood side by side for a moment, staring down at the patient who had, against all odds, survived. There were still questions to answer, sabotage to uncover, political consequences waiting just outside the sterile walls of the surgical suite. But for now, the hybrid lived. And that was enough.